All right, buckle up for a deep dive this time. We're heading into some seriously dark territory with this one. Pedro Alonso Lopez, ever heard of him?
Not till you sent me all this material.
Yeah.
Well, the monster of the Andes is not exactly an understatement.
I was going to say that title alone is enough to send chills down your spine.
Yeah.
And what's really gotten to me is the sheer scale of it all. Potentially hundreds of victims. It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, and how it's almost like he fell through the cracks of history,
Yeah.
you know? But the victims are real. Real people with real families, and it's important that we don't forget that.
Right. A phantom preying on the most vulnerable. Vanishing into thin air. South America in the late 20th century. Disappearances. Fear. Questions with no answers. I've got a lot to unpack here, and yeah, this one's going to be tough.
It is. To truly understand how a person could do these kinds of things, we got to go back to the start. Lopez was born in Colombia, 1948, the seventh of 13 children.
Whoa, 13. I can't even imagine. That right there is chaos. Poverty too, I'm guessing.
You guessed right. And his father was murdered before Lopez was even born.
So violence and instability from day one.
Yeah. And then it gets worse. His mother was involved in sex work, so you can imagine the kind of environment that created.
Yeah, it's like a textbook case of a traumatic upbringing, but like you said before, not everyone who goes through that becomes a serial killer.
No, definitely not. It's never that simple.
So what happened next? What sent him down this path?
Well, this is where that cycle of abuse starts. His own mother kicked him out of the house when he was just 8.
8. What's why?
She caught him molesting his younger sister.
Oh, God. That's just heartbreaking. Clearly something was deeply wrong even at that age.
Absolutely. Rejected by his own family at 8 years old, he ended up on the streets of Bogota, alone. While he was out there, he was repeatedly sexually abused.
It's like he was trapped in this horrifying cycle of victimization. Did he ever find any kind of stability, any support at all?
Briefly, when he was around 12, an American family took him in.
Oh, okay. Maybe that was a turning point.
Not exactly. The abuse continued. A teacher at his school assaulted him. Lopez ended up running away.
It's like every attempt at normalcy, every chance for a fresh start just led to more pain.
Exactly. And that pattern, it continued into adulthood. At 21, he was in prison for auto theft.
Right.
While he was in prison, he was brutally raped by multiple inmates.
Horrible.
Yeah, he ended up killing 3 of them.
Whoa. So the violence is escalating. That line between victim and perpetrator, it's blurring. It's almost like a twisted reflection of the abuse he suffered.
Right. And prison obviously did nothing to rehabilitate him.
So what happened when he got out?
That's when things take a really dark turn. Lopez was released in 1978 and started traveling all over South America. He later claimed that's when the real killing spree began, mostly young girls from indigenous communities.
Oh, man. Over 100 murders during that time, according to him. It's hard to even comprehend. Why target indigenous girls specifically?
That's the thing. Those communities were often marginalized, you know. Their disappearances, they weren't always thoroughly investigated. It speaks to a much larger issue, the vulnerability of certain groups and how the system often fails them.
It's chilling. Predators always seem to target those they see as weak or less likely to be missed. Didn't something happen with an indigenous tribe in Peru, though?
Right. They caught him trying to abduct a young girl, a 9-year-old. Their response, they were going to bury him alive.
Wow. That's intense. Sounds like they understood the gravity of what he was doing.
They did, but an American missionary intervened, convinced them to hand him over to the police.
Okay, so finally he's going to be locked up, right?
You'd think so, but no, they deported him.
What? They just let him go after all that.
Unbelievable.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's like this one incident, it's a microcosm of his whole story. Slipping through the cracks, escaping consequences, the cycle of violence just keeps spinning.
Exactly. Missed opportunities, systemic failures. And sadly, this pattern, it continues as his crimes escalate.
So what happens next?
Well, authorities in Ecuador, they started noticing more and more young girls were going missing. But they didn't connect the dots.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they thought it was human trafficking, which was a problem in the region. They completely missed the bigger picture, this terrifying pattern that was unfolding right in front of them.
So how did they finally figure it out?
It took a horrifying discovery. In 1980, there was this flash flood in Ambato.
Right.
It unearthed the remains of multiple missing girls.
Oh, God.
Yeah, a horrifying secret hidden beneath the surface.
It's almost like poetic justice, the earth itself revealing the truth.
Right. And that's when the police finally started to take a closer look.
So the flood was a turning point.
Absolutely. It forced them to confront the reality. They had a serial killer on their hands, not just some human trafficking ring. This is where things get even darker.
Okay. Tell me about his capture then. How did they finally catch him?
It was almost by chance. Another day in Ambato, Lopez tried to abduct a young girl, Marie Poveda. Luckily, some local merchants, they saw what was happening, intervened, and held him until the police got there.
Everyday heroes.
Yeah, absolutely. But getting a confession from him, that was a whole other story. He refused to talk to the police.
So how do they break him?
They put an undercover officer in his cell, disguised as a prisoner.
Ah, smart.
And that's when he started talking. Boasting, actually.
What do you think was going on in his mind? Arrogance. Did he need to relive those crimes?
It's hard to say, but his confession, it revealed a lot. A need to not just admit, but to revel in it. He claimed to have murdered hundreds of girls. Ecuador, Peru, Colombia. He described how he lured them, raped them, strangled them, even had tea parties with their bodies after he exhumed them.
Tea parties. That's just beyond comprehension. How do you even process that kind of information?
It's a challenge. Even after years of studying criminal minds, the tea parties, that points to necrophilia, a fascination with death and the dead. Really disturbing.
And a complete lack of empathy. Respect for human life, like they were just objects to be used and discarded, even after death.
Exactly. And that confession, as horrifying as it was just the tip of the iceberg. This case, it's about Lopez, but it's also about the systems that failed to stop him.
Right. This is just the beginning then.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes next, but we have to continue, right? For the victims, for the truth.
We do. And the next part of this deep dive, it takes us into some even murkier territory. We're going to delve into Lopez's psychology, his motivations, and the unsettling possibility that he might still be out there. Welcome back. Last time, we left off with that bone-chilling confession, right? A glimpse into the mind of, well, a man who committed unspeakable acts. The question I keep coming back to is what could drive someone to do such things?
That's a question, isn't it? We've talked about his childhood, all that trauma, poverty, abandonment, the abuse. It's clear his early life was, well, a breeding ground for something awful. But you said it yourself. Trauma doesn't automatically equal serial killer.
Right. Trauma can have a devastating impact, absolutely. But correlation doesn't equal causation, right? There are plenty of people who experience terrible things and don't become, well, monsters. There's something else going on here, something deeper. And that's what makes these cases so fascinating and so difficult to unpack.
So where do we even start? What other pieces of the puzzle might help us understand what happened?
Well, one thing that criminologists and psychologists often look at in cases like this is personality disorders.
Okay.
In Lopez's case, specifically, some experts think he might have had antisocial personality disorder, ASPD.
ASPD, I've heard of that. What does that mean exactly?
Well, ASPD, it's basically a pattern of disregard for violating the rights of others. People with ASPD, they often lack empathy. They don't feel remorse or guilt. And they can be impulsive, deceitful, risky. And they often have this superficial charm. You know, they use it to manipulate people.
That definitely sounds like Lopez. The lack of remorse, the way he seemed to enjoy the suffering he inflicted, the way he charmed those girls, tricked them. But is ASPD, is that enough to explain everything?
It's complicated. ASPD is a complex diagnosis. We don't want to oversimplify. But, you know, looking at his behavior through that lens, it can offer some insights into why he did what he did.
Right. It's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. So what other pieces are we missing?
Well, his sexual deviance is another big part of it. His crimes, they weren't just about violence. There was a deeply disturbing sexual element. All young girls, many of them prepubescent. And his methods, those rituals, they suggest he got pleasure from their pain. Sadistic pleasure.
The tea parties. It's almost impossible to even think about. And necrophilia, right? That fascination with death, that adds another layer of complexity to it all.
Exactly. Necrophilia is something people don't like to talk about. It's often misunderstood. But in cases like this, it's important. It tells us something about his complete detachment from reality, his lack of empathy, his disrespect for human life. Those victims, they were nothing to him, just objects.
It's like he was living out some twisted fantasy, totally disconnected from the consequences of his actions.
Yeah. And while we can analyze and theorize all we want, we may never truly know what was going on in his head. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying to understand. The more we learn about the darkest parts of human nature, the better chance we have of stopping something like this from happening again.
Right. So we've got this traumatic childhood, a possible personality disorder,
Mhm.
a deeply disturbing sexual deviance. It's like a perfect storm, right? A recipe for creating a monster.
Yeah, you could say that. It's rarely just one thing. It's a combination of events and experiences and predispositions, all these factors that come together and shape a person's behavior.
And the scariest part of it all is that he just disappeared, vanished, never faced justice.
His disappearance in '99, it's still a mystery. Some people think he might have gone back to his old hunting grounds, Ecuador, Colombia, blended back into those shadows where he could operate unseen.
The thought of him still being out there, that's terrifying.
It is, and it shows how hard it is for law enforcement to track these kinds of fugitives, especially when they're good at hiding, when they know the area, when they prey on vulnerable communities.
Makes you wonder what we can do to prevent this from happening again. Is it better law enforcement? Addressing those inequalities? Mental health? Is it all of the above?
It's a tough question, no easy answers, but I think it starts with awareness. We need to understand the signs, the risk factors. We need to empower communities, support victims, and hold people accountable.
It's a call to action, I
Yeah.
guess. We all have a role to play. But this story, it doesn't have a happy ending. He's out there somewhere, a ghost. And that's unsettling.
It is. It reminds us that justice isn't always served. Monsters don't always get caught. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But we can't give up hope. We can't let fear control us.
You're right. We have to keep searching for answers, fighting for justice, telling the victims' stories, because they mattered.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about his crimes, his mind, his disappearance. What else is there to uncover?
Well, I think we need to shift our focus now. We've talked a lot about the darkness, the monster. But the victims, they're the ones who really suffered. Their stories deserve to be told, to be remembered. We need to move beyond just being fascinated by the killer and honor the memory of those he took from us.
Yeah, you're right. It's so easy to get lost in the psychology of it all, the why and how.
Mm.
But the victims, their stories, that's what we can't forget. So let's talk about them. What can you tell me about their lives based on what we've been looking at?
That's the hard part. A lot of Lopez's victims were young girls from poor families, indigenous communities. Their disappearances, well, sometimes they weren't even reported. And even when they were, the investigations weren't always thorough. Those communities were marginalized, easy targets.
It's awful. Those inequalities just make everything worse, don't they? Those girls deserve justice, and the system failed them. It's a dark reflection on humanity. Not just Lopez himself, but the structures that allowed all of this to happen.
And even now, all these years later, so many of their stories are still untold. We know the numbers, the estimates, but their names, their dreams, we don't know them. They've become statistics, and it's a tragedy.
It's chilling, isn't it? Each number, a life, a whole world of possibilities gone. And the families of those whose remains were found. I mean, that kind of loss, the way they were taken, it's just unimaginable.
The trauma those families have endured, it's immeasurable. The not knowing, the years of wondering, the fear. Losing a child is one of the worst things imaginable. But to lose them like that, it leaves scars.
Scars that might never heal. And the ripple effects, they go beyond the immediate family, don't they? Communities, generations. And in this case, the fact that Lopez just disappeared, never faced any consequences, that adds another layer to it all.
Yeah, that lack of closure, the thought that he could be out there somewhere living his life, it's a lot to carry. But it's important to remember that even though he's gone, the search for answers, the pursuit of justice, it doesn't end. There are people, organizations still working to identify his victims, to bring some peace to those families.
And that's good to hear. It shows that even in the face of such darkness, such awful loss, there's still hope.
There is. And we can't let cases like this fade away. We have to keep talking about them, keep learning, keep fighting for a world where this doesn't happen.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this dark world, this unsettling story, what are your final thoughts? What can we take away from all of this as
Yeah.
people, as a society?
Well, I think it's a reminder that monsters are real. But it also shows us that we need to understand them, understand human behavior, the things that lead to violence, the systems that allow it to happen. We have to be vigilant, protect the vulnerable, and never stop seeking justice for those who've been silenced.
Well said. This has been a tough conversation, a lot to think about. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. It wasn't easy, but it was important. And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to look into the research, the resources that are out there. Every voice that speaks out, every attempt to understand the darkness, it brings us closer to a world where monsters like Pedro Alonso Lopez can't hide anymore.